Good afternoon and welcome to our panel discussion on the excellence in supply chain. First off, let me just start with saying that the concept of harnessing the power of a company's supply chain as a means for driving business growth, it's really been rapidly evolving since the early 80s, when that term was coined. And excellence in supply chain strategies, including those of lean, the principles of lean, they really provide us with a way to move forward ahead of our competition in an increasingly complex environment, which I don't know if I dare say, can we get any more complex than we have in the last 9 months? I don't want to jinx us by any means. In today's panel discussion, we will have the opportunity to discuss some of those complexities and the way in which our panelists, which are going to be in a moment, are continuing to ensure the excellence in our supply chain. So with that introduction of the panel itself, let me go ahead and introduce myself. I am Chris Hayes. I am your panel moderator, and briefly I will allow each of our panelists to take about 15 seconds, if you would, to introduce yourselves. Aaron, would you like to go ahead and start us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. My name is Aaron Lord. I'm the Senior Director of Supply Chain Planning and Operational Excellence for Capri Holdings Limited. We're a fashion luxury group, and we own the brands Versace, Jimmy Choo, and Michael Kors.
Perfect. Thank you. Beau?
Hi, everybody. My name is Beau Keyte. I have my own consulting company. I've been working in lean and continuous improvement for probably 3 decades, about half of that in supply chain. And I also teach supply chain and other things online with the University of Dayton in their MBA program.
Thank you, Beau. Appreciate it. Sally?
Hi, I'm Sally Canario. I'm a Senior Director of Supply Chain Operational Excellence at a 3PL, and I also teach Lean Six Sigma Black Belt at USC.
Thank you, Sally. And Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary Peterson. I'm the Executive Vice President of Supply Chain and Manufacturing for the O.C. Tanner Company. We're a $500 million global company focused on employee rewards and recognition. And I'm just delighted to be on the panel today.
Well, we are delighted to have each one of you. I don't know if the participants realize what experts we have with us today, and I can't wait to start the discussion and hear what you all have to say and your experiences with the supply chain and what you've been doing to not only prepare, but again, to ensure the excellence in the supply chain. So we're going to start off as our questioning. We will ask each panelist a question, no particular order, and we will give each one about a minute to answer, uninterrupted, as our debates have been, only we'll do much better at it. After that, we're going to open it up and allow a discussion with the other panelists, a short discussion, and then we will move on so we get a lot more questions answered, quantity over quality, and then we will end with a Q&A session about 10 to 15 minutes before the end of the hour. As a note, I will state that you do have a question and answer selection down at the bottom. If you have a question, go ahead and click that button. You can type it into the box, and then when we get to the question and answer phase, we will choose, time allowing, of course, we will choose some questions and have the panelists answer. So with that, let's start off with Aaron. Aaron, given what I said, our complex environment, what impact has COVID-19 had on your particular supply chain, and what have you done to mitigate the disruptions you've experienced?
So I think it's important to go back, Chris, and reiterate what you said earlier, and that supply chains are complex and becoming more complex over time. So I think that's a level set for the entire discussion, right? Is that we're dealing with a very complex system, and so when you have a disruption, there's a lot of work that has to be done. So really, what happened with us, I want to set the tone going back to prior to COVID. And I think we had, Gary and I were talking about this in another conversation. what we ended up with is this unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence of those U.S.-China tariffs is that we were forced to diversify. So if you look at it from a global perspective, it maybe didn't have the same impact, but the U.S. market is fairly large. And really what happened to us from the retail market is U.S.-China tariffs hit, we needed a different strategy. We went out and diversified our supplier base globally through different regions and different countries. That was pre-COVID. Once COVID hit, that actually gave us it made us more nimble because we had options. So we wasn't planned for, but it worked out well. And once that hit, it became for us, it was the timing. So you had COVID hit different countries, different regions at different times. And if everybody remembers, it was like this big tidal wave. I always go back and say, this big tidal wave was coming to the US, and we kind of knew it was coming, but I think we all didn't think that it was going to hit like it did. And so you have this the timing and the stop of the demand. First was the demand, and right after demand was cash flow. Cash flow stopped. And right after cash flow stopped, everybody started to settle in and realize what was going on in the US and really globally. And that was that we had this influx of inventory everywhere. So if you think about it, you have this global supply chain system, you have a lot of inventory in WIP. And when you stop demand immediately, the brakes, I think it was March 13th when the brakes were hit in the US. So you had the entire US system stop, and then cash flow stop. But we had a lot of WIP in the system that was already on its way. And so we really had to say, okay, what are we going to do with that? And then we had to think about at the same time, now it trickles all the way down to the supplier base. And you think about the impact to all of them that they have when cash flow stops, orders stop, and they're basically out of business. So how do we protect our supplier base through that system? So some of the action that we took is, our first was to say, okay, what do we do with this WIP? We have a lot of inventory coming at us throughout the globe. How do we deal with it if it isn't going anywhere? And in the retail market, there's some seasonality to the stuff that you're doing. So when you think about that is, okay, I have this stuff coming for a time that I can't use it. And the stuff that I'm probably going to need later, I'm going to need, but I'm going to have this other stuff in the way. So how do we deal with that? And once we did that, we really had to say, okay, let's reset ourselves on our operational expectations. What are our ways of working in this time of disruption? It's not normal. All of our history was lost. So when you talk about planning, you don't know what to plan for. So we really had to say, okay, how do we operate different as a group to manage through this? And then once we started doing that, we then had to say, okay, what's the short-term horizon? And I can't wait to hear from Gary on this, is that, again, going back, we lost history. And if you talk about planning, you really rely on historical information. We didn't know what consumers were doing. So to plan for that was very difficult. So we had to get a grasp of, what do the next 13 weeks look like? What does next week look like? And you're really going back and rebuilding the business to start to say, okay, how do we do this? So that was first. And then once we started to grasp and the engine started moving again, then we had to say, okay, what's the long-term strategy? What does life look like after COVID? So if I were to take it and break it down those 4 layers, it was just, what do we do with the immediate? How do we operate together? What does short-term horizon look like? Let's get that. And then let's rethink what the future looks like for us.
Thank you very much. And, mindset becomes very important, and it sounds like that was a big hurdle for your organization to jump through, and it sounds like you were able to jump through it very well. Any other quick comments from the rest of the panelists?
Maybe one thing I'd add, so it sounds like I went through the exact same experience Aaron did. A couple of slight tweaks. We felt like at the beginning of COVID, man, good thing we reacted so well to the tariffs. We're in great shape. And then 2 months later, all that advantage had evaporated, basically. And it's just been so difficult to get things on the boat. And but as products became unavailable, we had to establish new sources for products. We had to establish new products themselves that I think otherwise we were looking at things we wouldn't otherwise have been open to doing. And so in a way, responding to COVID pushed us into new, exciting directions, I think. And I think our supplier relationships really mattered because they really can't satisfy everyone, but ours felt like they were working to satisfy us. And so that's a big deal. It was also great to be able to strategize with them about what other options might be available to us. So I would say that being helped by our response to the tariffs was good luck, but having good relationships with our suppliers, always a good idea. It definitely paid off.
And when it comes to supply chain management, relationships, I think a lot of us know that really is kind of the secret sauce to almost anything, whether it's supply chain or any business model or process. Relationships get us through the worst of times. So great, thank you both. We're going to move on to the next question. Gary, I'm going to give this question to you since you did such a great job coming up with some commentary there. Name two things, since we're on the subject of COVID-19, name two things that you would have done differently a year ago regarding the application of lean specifically, had you known that COVID-19 was coming our way.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you right now, we're working very closely and effectively with IT on vendor feeds and automation. I sure wish we'd done that a year ago. Our purchasing analysts are doing so much more work right now just to keep us in product. And that's the work that we're finally automating because we have to. We should have done that a year ago, and then they wouldn't have had to carry this extra burden for the last several months. I think we also would have had a much more responsive and tight domestic supply chain if we put in the vendor feeds that we're doing now. So that's one thing I would have done, is work more closely with IT to improve our technology. We've been pushed into each other's arms, and it's become a very loving relationship, which is nice. The second thing that we would have done differently a year ago is I think we wouldn't have ignored some of the American brands that we shunned because they were anywhere from 3 to 10% more expensive. There's some phenomenal brands where we didn't have a relationship when we needed it. And I think we shouldn't have been so low cost focused in hindsight. We're now going to be more open to more brands, spread out the costs, spread out the countries of origin more.
Diversification, yeah, absolutely. Any other comments?
Yeah, I will. This is Aaron. So you go, and this, maybe this is more a question for Gary.
Sorry, my little dinger was going off for Gary's 1 minute and he was perfect. So I apologize. Go right ahead.
Okay, and maybe this is more a question back to Gary, just thinking through the IT piece. So I know one of the things that I wish we had done, and it's really, I guess it's the timing of it, is really having the right technology in place to get to real-time supply chain decision making. So if you talk about, one is the historical that helps you plan, but then that real-time visibility to start to say, okay, here's what's happening in these alerts so that you can take action. And I really feel like that's a necessity nowadays. And I'm curious if that aligns to what you're talking about, is having some of that IT in place to do those kinds of things.
Absolutely. I mean, we have been looking at, we use SAP, and we've been looking at all the functionality that we haven't turned on, that we've just been trusting in our heads. We've been doing too much thinking, too much manual planning and doing, when really the system could be working more for us, which I'm not thinking of it in terms of, you know, I can shed some jobs. I'm thinking in terms of, I have better things for these people to do than this manual work that they've been doing.
Got it. Thank you, Gary.
I'd like to add to that. And where I am, there was definitely a concern around making sure our folks were safe. So if we're having to do team lift, being able to switch to mech lift so that we wouldn't have people within a trailer within 6 feet of each other. So really, I think for my company, it would have been planning ahead a year versus doing it this year, right? So absolutely, that resonates with me as well.
And it's just too bad that we don't have that crystal ball to help us know what's coming, right? And how to prepare for it. Thank you all for your input. Okay, let's go to another question. Sally, I'd like to ask you to name 2 primary obstacles to overcome when implementing lean in the supply chain. What have you experienced, and what would be your advice?
So my advice would be overcoming these 2 primary obstacles, which would be leadership support and sustainment when leadership does change. Also, building from bottoms up, making sure that you have a high-performing culture, really taking the time to explain why we're doing this, and that way we can bring people along the journey, right? So oftentimes when you want to create a culture of problem visibility, it really comes from the top down, that Hoshin Conry. I've been fortunate at my current company where my top leaders are supportive of this, and so this is the reason why we're able to sustain and to grow with our Lean Six Sigma program at work. So absolutely, those would be my advice, to talk about leadership support, as well as making sure that all of your leaders, from middle management all the way down to the people who are doing the work, are engaged in building a high-performing culture.
Yeah.
Both very important. Anything to add?
Maybe just another thought, very short, around the training of your people. Everyone on the supply chain staff who you want to buy into Lean, they deserve to know the how and the why. And that's why we have to spend the time teaching them and helping them get in there.
Yeah, that why behind it, that sense of, adds to that sense of urgency for people to understand what is their role and what's in it for them. And all three of those are very important in my experience. So thank you. Any other adds?
Yeah, I think it's going back to Sally, and Sally's like the master. So anytime I'm talking to someone, I always feel like I'm talking to my teacher. But I think there's something that resonates with Sally and Gary, is that those are all cultural pieces,
yeah. Right?
And culture is so important. It's the foundation of Lean. So
yeah.
You can't do it without it, right? That is the secret sauce.
Yep.
To Lean.
Bravo, Aaron.
I would just add that as you go through this and teach them, is also implicit in leadership, allowing them to fail and learn.
Mm.
If you're expecting them to do perfectly on day one, it's not going to happen. It never has. So how do you demonstrate the fact that this is a learning experience in order to be where we want to be and go where we want to go?
That kind of brings us full circle to Sally's first comment about leadership support. The right leader who's humble, who's respectful, who coaches and develops people, he or she will do what Beau just said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to add that with this problem solving, making those incremental changes over time will really move your company in the right direction, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be a new design. It can always be those small incremental changes. And so having that leadership support that is so important. And I'm lucky where I am, where my leadership team really wants to do the right thing for the customer every time.
Thank you. Yeah, and that definitely trickles, whether you're doing that inside of your own organization, but trickling that down through to your suppliers, that mindset can make all of the difference. But circling all the way back to what Sally started with, it's leadership. It really comes down to that mindset from leaders. So thank you very much. I think we hit just about every aspect of importance there. Great job. Okay, Beau, you're up. What I'd like to ask you is hypothetical. If you had a magic wand that you could wave just once and make one improvement in how the supply chain is managed, what would it be?
I'd love to have that magic wand. I would, but I want to actually piggyback on what Gary and Chris started off with in terms of what I consider the social aspects of a supply chain. Everybody learns one way or another in a supply chain the technical aspects, inventory levels, optimizing logistics, even the legal aspects of contracts, making sure the lawyer and having everything fully vetted by the lawyers. That doesn't define success long term, and certainly doesn't define success in something as complex, the market is as complex as we see now. So I would like to wave a magic wand and create open, collaborative relationships with our suppliers. So imagine that you're producing to someone, you have two sets of customers. One set of customers approaches you on a regular basis, shares information like the risks they see, markets they're thinking about, challenges they have, and maybe some things to work on together, and maybe even to plan or mitigate plans for mitigating risk in the future. The other list or set of customers sends you monthly updates on how you're performing against your contract. Now, we have tariffs, trade wars, pandemics, and you don't have the capacity to produce to everybody. You have to choose. Which set of customers are you going to ship to first? So I think that is incumbent upon us to acknowledge the fact that we need the technical aspects of the supply chain, but also embrace the fact we need to get social with these guys to understand their perspectives, so it's a two-way relationship that can win long term.
Perfect. Anybody have something to add to that?
Good.
Anybody want the magic wand?
I want the magic wand. I don't think I can't pry it out of Beau's hands.
Let's see. I think we have 121 to make. That's how many participants we have right now. We have to send them out fast.
All right. Well, if no further comment, I will go ahead and jump to the next question. Sally, we're going to put you in the hot seat again. Can you provide 2 examples of tangible and or financial results of implementing lean specifically in your supply chain?
Well, that's pretty easy. I would say the 2 tangible results in implementing lean in my supply chain would be cycle time reduction, as well as bottom line improvements such as EBITDA through labor productivity improvements. And I would actually challenge that there's a third, which is customer satisfaction. And that way we can really grow as an organization to grow our top line. So really, I think those are the 3 that we should go for, right? So, yep, hope that answers your question.
It does, and I like your third. The old saying, if you focus on the customer, everything else will come. And I think that's definitely not meant to be number 3 as in priority. So thank you.
Yeah.
Add?
Well, if I could add one more, and I think it's actually inherent in Sally's first 2, but working capital frees up as turns improve, more cash for the business to use elsewhere. And I have found that to be very effective for getting finance on your side, saying, hey, I like what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree. When you start to think of your organization, you think about turns and working capital and the benefits to it, and then you say, okay, well, how do I do that? And it always goes back to cycle time and tackling those things. And I want to even look at cycle time in different views, right? You have the cycle time of goods, but you also have the cycle time of the flow of information, which is just as valuable. Because not only now are you speeding up the velocity of goods, but you're speeding up decision making, right? And building that culture that's educated in making better decisions through a system, and more confident in their decisions. So it's you get a lot of wins out of cycle time, and sometimes I think people miss the value of the flow of information.
Absolutely.
Right, and I would have to agree with you, Erin. The cash conversion cycle is absolutely important. How quickly can you convert your sales into cash is so important. So absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we will go to our next question. Gary, let's throw you on the hot seat now. Are there any lean tools that you would consider more beneficial or maybe easier to use than others when implementing lean in the supply chain?
Yeah, I'll start with one that maybe you wouldn't expect. I think the gimbal walk, talking with and becoming aware of what your people are dealing with, that really improves us as leaders. It creates buy-in from our people. I think being there where the work is done is invaluable. So that's one. Another one I would say is get people working in teams so they can share best practices and ideas. They can start solving their problems, driving the daily continuous improvement. I think people closest to the job are the ones who are best suited to make improvements to that job. And they do that extremely well, I have found, when they're working together as a group. And maybe the last tool I'll mention, which also might be a surprise, is 5S. It improves efficiency, it reduces errors, it makes waste more visible. When we first started talking about it with our supply chain people, they were like, you got to be kidding me. And after they implemented, they were delighted with the results.
One of the simple foundational tools that we oftentimes don't understand the value of. I've also seen that same reaction, and you kind of have to chuckle in the beginning, knowing what's coming, but you have to be patient while they learn through the journey. Any other comments?
I would also want to add waste walk, just understanding your downtime in your process, just in order for you to eliminate your waste so that it goes away completely, right? The second tool I would also recommend is aligning your team members to the same goal, and that would be with your project charter or your lean problem solving tool. So I think this really helps with the right mindset of really focusing the team on what's in scope and out of scope so that they're not spinning. So absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I would add that if you put a lot of these things together, you get into a learning environment. And going back to my comment on allowing people to fail, as you implement these things, focus on scientific thinking or PDCA as you pilot stuff, and not expect people to get the right solution immediately, because they never do. So being deliberate about planning, doing, checking, and adjusting in order to iterate until you get to the goal is really, really important. And it really encompasses much of the things that that Sally and Gary have talked about.
Can I piggyback on that real quick? I'm sure Aaron wants to jump in, but I think that, again, going back to the importance of the leader has to make it safe for them to experiment and to try things. And we don't think of it as failure. We think of it as learning. You find something that doesn't work, you experiment with something and it doesn't work. Hey, like, wow, we just learned something excellent. So we always figure, as you're going through PDCA cycles, you're either getting smarter or you're getting better. I don't see a downside to either of those.
I agree with you, Gary. I'm curious to hear from the group if you think about this, because I'm sure all of you have had lots of experiences in lean, and lean doesn't always work the same way in every organization, and it always goes back to the maturity of it too, right? Where you are in that journey. And one of the things that I like to think of, if you think about where are you in that journey, let's classify these tools into these buckets of things, okay, to simplify it, because sometimes, depending upon where you are on the journey, names can be intimidating, right, if they don't understand it. So let's simplify it for a minute and say, okay, and I go back to these 4 capabilities, and I'm a big fan of Stephen Spear and his books. And let's start with the capability, and let's say, do we have tools that fulfill the capability of designing and operating our work to reveal problems? And Gary, you bring up a good point of that. Problems should be recognized and celebrated. And failure is one of those places where you should celebrate, because you learned something from it, right? Everybody learned. And now okay, when you do that, what it looks like, and you can always go back to what you were doing before. So, building that culture of doing that. And then next is, if you can start to identify your problems, next is, okay, what are the tools that give us the capability to problem solve, right? Swarm, contain, and solve those problems. Do we have a set of tools to do those? And then if we have that, what are the tools that help us take what we've learned from the failures and the successes and share that throughout the organization so that we build a learning culture? And then if we have those, okay, how do we have tools and processes in place to build our leaders to continuously coach and mentor on those first 3? So I really think of them always in those buckets. And sometimes, depending upon the maturity of the organization, the names are intimidating. So, I don't care what you call it. We can call it whatever you want, but does it fulfill these buckets? And does it help us do these things?
Mike Rother said brilliantly in his book on Toyota Kata, he talks about how, you know, us in the Western society, we go to Toyota in cars and planes and trains, and we visit, and they welcome us into their facilities to see what they have going on, and we come back and we're awed, and ooh, ah, look, there's Kanban, look, there's this, and all of these names, to your point, Erin, and these tools, and we get back and we implement them, and they sometimes do good things. To your point, not every organization implements or gets the same benefits out of Lean the same as another. And when we get back and we try to do this and it doesn't quite work, and I'm one of those years ago that did the tool thing, and it's like, what's going on? So we're shaking our heads, and at the same time, the folks at Toyota, who this is part of their DNA, this is their culture, they're scratching their heads going, why are they asking about our solutions? Why aren't they asking about how we solve our problems so that they can learn how to solve their own problems their way? So perfect information that you're going all of you have jumped in. Sally, were you going to jump in there?
Oh, I just wanted to add that in where I work, as well as what I do at USC, we learn and do. So we think about ways of not only doing Lean, but also marrying that up with Six Sigma. So it's Plan, Do, Check, Act for most folks who are Toyota Production Systems. And on our side, with Lean Six Sigma, it's define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. So that real data-driven approach is important. I like teaching my leadership at my work how to do promoting using different tools, and they're not always going to use every single tool in the toolbox, whether or not it's, you know, FMEA or a Pareto chart. There's so many different tools, and whenever they come across a problem, as long as they know how to do it and they have that muscle memory from learning from our weeklies that we do, they can at least, you know, think back to say, I can use this tool for this specific problem that I'm trying to solve. And this is the same concept that we have at USC for the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt class, is that we think about learning and doing. So we learn a concept and then we apply it to our real project. And that way, the next time around when you go through something like this, you'll remember from that muscle memory that you've done this before, and then this is how you should be doing it. So absolutely agree with what you said.
Brilliant.
Nice. Hey, can I add one more thing? So I loved Erin's comment about a learning organization. And Chris, since you brought up Mike Rother, I was sitting in a class of his shortly after his book came out. And he made a comment that has just stuck with me. He said that a manager's #1 responsibility is to teach their people how to be creative. And I think that fits nicely with this learning organization. If you believe that everyone on your team is creative, should be creative, I want to teach you to be more creative. I think that's powerful Lean.
It goes to Beau's comment as well, because being creative requires that we're okay if you fail fast, fail cheap, and move on and experiment. So I think we've come full circle with all of our comments.
Amazing.
We can keep talking about this one. It's fun.
So
no other questions needed, right? That's the problem with a panel like this, is we could probably in the background, outside of any participants, just kind of chat with each other. So and go on and on and on. So we would never end. But in light of our time frame, let's go on to our next question. Let's see here. Erin, what is the one piece of advice you would give your supply chain to help them better prepare for risks?
Oof. Just do it right. Just fix it. No. So I'd call it agile resilience, and here's why I say that. The speed of change as we move forward is going to continue to increase as you think about the way the world is working. Information is getting larger. Our ability to make decisions is becoming faster. So that means that at the end of the day, the change that we're going to make is going to be faster, more confident, but more often, right? And so now it really goes back to that point of failure. More decisions, we may have more failure. but we're going to make a lot of decisions. So we need to be agile because supply chains are very complex, and we're going to continue to have challenges, whether it's another COVID, global warming, various country trade agreements that cause disruption for any organization. Things are always going to change, and we need to be agile. But I go back to the resilience in that we can't just do it once or a couple of times and be agile. There needs to be this resilience that we're going to live and breathe it forever. And that's going to be okay, is that we live in a world of change. We need to be agile, and we need to accept it. So that resilience piece to me is super important. And when I look back on it in the things that I've been through and watched other organizations go through COVID, the differentiator, I think, has been resilience. The ability for the group to make it through the storm, knowing that there's an end, keeping positivity was a differentiator.
Easy to do what you're supposed to do when things are normal, but you really know whether you've got it together if you can do it when things go awry and you're really under that stress.
Yeah, you agree. You think about all this stuff, it's theory that we talk about with, okay, we're going to have a disruption. But then if you break it down to the smallest level of detail, the devil is in the details. At the end of the day, people are going to have conversations. They're going to start to problem solve. They're going to have disagreements. That sometimes they're going to make bad decisions or good decisions. Within that, that's where resilience lives and needs to live. Is because those things are going to happen every day, and that's where the resilience needs to support it.
Very good. Any other comments? That question?
Well, you'll be surprised to know I have something to say. I thought,
what you have to say.
as Aaron was talking, I thought about how at the beginning of COVID, as our people were working, there was a sense of almost like a hanging on. And I noticed that despite all of our practice with following certain systems, our coaching system, our huddle system, our team meetings, our, whatever it is, strategy deployment, people kind of were thinking, okay, we don't do those things now because we're hanging on in a pandemic. And those are actually the times when you've got to practice your systems. You've got to do the kata that got you where you are. And I was surprised that I had to remind people, no, we're gonna do what we know works. And people seem surprised. No, don't you see there's a pandemic going on? And I just think it's really important that that's one of the things we've learned. Nobody wants to live 2020 again. This has been a horrible year, but look how much we've learned. Look how much we've grown. And so in a way, maybe we ought to look at risk is when something goes bad, it's like, man, what are we going to learn from this? This is awesome. We got a growth opportunity here. It's just a thought.
No, and it's
I think
a good
it's a good thought.
Yeah.
I was thinking that as you said that, Gary, that when we think about risk and do risk assessments and do contingency plans, we don't dial in the mindset of the person walking in.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just explained was they're walking in shock. And somehow you have to pull them back together. And I don't think anyone's ever thought of that in contingency planning.
Yeah.
Very good point. Anything else to add on that one? Risk is always such a fun conversation to have. And I remember I was when this all kind of really went crazy, we kind of knew it was coming, but then I was in the middle of teaching a supply chain class actually. And we were at the point where we were talking about risks and how do you prepare for them. And you could kind of see, you probably witnessed this, where you start talking about risk and it's always that kind of, it'll never happen to us. And I was giving examples of horrible things that could happen. And we talked about not a pandemic, but like a huge disruption in the supply chain, and their eyes were glazed over, and they're not really paying attention. And the director of supply chain that was in the class, it was for one specific company, he got the call and he found out that the disruption with COVID was causing them not to be able to get one of their major supply chain product families in. And so all of the sudden it was, of course, he had to leave for a minute or more, but he came back and it made the connection for them. So to your point, Gary, I mean, I think that these are learning lessons, and I hope we will all take the opportunity in 2021, when I hope that it's over and we're looking back at it, and be able to see the positives that came out of it, because there are some. We never knew we needed to do the things that we had to do, and we didn't know how resilient we were or not resilient, and we've been able to change those things. So wonderful, wonderful, positive attitude to COVID. I like that. All right, we have 2 questions left. Beau, I'm going to pick on you. This is a hot topic in the lean world. There have been a few articles related to lean, specifically being the cause of the supply chain issues we've had since COVID-19. What are your thoughts on this claim, and how would you counter such a claim?
I think it's great to find something to blame. Isn't this wonderful? We have one thing we can blame this whole mess on, and it's lean. In all seriousness, I'm going to mess up my 1-minute piece, but I got a phone call, I don't know, a month ago from a good friend of mine. Said, I just finished reading a Wall Street Journal article, and you're the reason that the supply chain's a mess. Yeah. And he starts laughing, and it made me sit back and think about how people perceive lean. And I think that my real take on these articles is that they're a bit naive in understanding how lean really works. Lean has nothing to do with strangling and starving a supply chain. All supply chains were starved coming from China. I'm betting some of them weren't lean. So it has to go beyond that. But going back to what lean can do, lean is supposed to be able to protect the customer. That means if you're the customer of a supplier and they have a 2-week lead time, you better have 2 weeks of raw materials sitting there as a safety stock, because you know it's going to take them 2 weeks to react to something. So dialing in the inventory levels is a function of the risk of the upstream operation or upstream organization. So we always worry about that, even at a micro level. Between 2 machines in a plant, if you have a 30-minute changeover upstream, you better have 30 minutes of product downstream, or you're going to get starved out. So when you scale it up to a supply chain level, you realize that everybody, each organization, should be taking into account the risk of the supply getting there. Just one piece is the lead time. It could be seasonality, it could be lots of things. And the lean supply chains that I've seen try to dial it in. The issue is the algorithm. So Aaron said a couple of minutes ago, the devil's in the details. The algorithm is pretty detailed. And in that algorithm, they never took into account tariffs, trade wars, and pandemics all hitting at once. There's not a single algorithm out there that dialed that stuff in. So it is about the math. And the algorithms weren't robust or resilient enough to really help us maintain a good supply chain, regardless of whether we were lean or not.
Right, and I would have to agree with Beau in that it's purely a supply chain policy issue and not a lean issue. We all know the safety stock calculation is a function of the variability of demand, and if you don't adjust for your demand based off of your changing demand, there was a huge shift in demand for PPE, and there just was no adjustment to that safety stock level to take into consideration lead time to build it, as well as the transportation lead time. So, and even with the situation of factories being shut down so that there was not that manufacturing of those items, this is well beyond lean, right? So we truly want to think about supply chain capacity with production, as well as a reordering issue. How do you adjust according to that? A lot of retail companies are set to a min-max, and so there's not that systemic adjustment. So really thinking about how do we become more agile when we think about how do we fluctuate our demand and our safety stock levels, right? So it's purely a supply chain policy issue.
Gary, were you going to jump in?
Well, I'll just, Aaron and I were talking about this before. I don't think we could have possibly reacted as healthy as we did if we were not as far along the lean journey as we were. I think it created capability to react that would have astonished us, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I just think about that problem solving piece, right? We had a problem, lots of problems. They had to be solved. And in my mind, the ability to solve those problems, the more refined you are, the better results you're going to get, the faster you're going to get there. And so that becomes an advantage versus a disadvantage in the situation.
So you mean we really didn't cause all this, right? What you're saying. I concur. Okay, last question before we jump into the Q&A session. Sally, I will pose this question to you. Is forcing lean on a supplier ever a good idea? And if so, what circumstances have you either had to or would you require that a supplier implement or adopt lean principles?
So first of all, forcing anyone to adopt lean is not a good idea. Bringing people along the journey is so important so that you can create a holistic approach to problem solving together. One situation that I was in a while back when I was working at an e-commerce company, the one that just had Prime Day yesterday and today, I worked on a project where we were dealing with heavy, bulky items and shipping TVs, and it truly was going upstream to make things and packaging e-commerce ready, right? So the expanded polyethylene, the packaging itself, just the entire delivery so that we wouldn't have to worry about a poor customer experience with breakage at last mile delivery. So truly that was exciting for me to work with our major suppliers to go upstream, to change their internal packaging, to identify the root causes of the damages we were seeing with any dead pixels or any screen cracks or things that could occur from dropping a corner of a TV, as an example. So truly it was a win-win for the customer as well as our company.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Any last comments from?
I agree entirely with Sally. I mean, lean is about respect, so force really doesn't fit. You're not going to make any progress without trust. And so I think words like persuasion and influence are probably better words. I mean, but it's definitely our responsibility to teach them and to help them and to gently push them to do the things that we need to do. We had a supplier who wanted to deliver us a monthly shipping container that traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast and then eventually came back to Salt Lake City. And we convinced them eventually to ship from the West Coast to Salt Lake City, even though they had to change significantly to do that. And they didn't see any advantage to them initially in doing that. Now they deliver us small shipments twice a week from the West Coast. And again, it required significant changes on their part, but it's given them a far superior distribution model. So in a way, we owed it to them to help them see that. I think the way we act, the example we set, the things we talk about, the things we ask them to do, those are the most powerful forces in helping our suppliers adapt.
Perfect. Well, those are the end of our questions, or my questions to you as a panel. We do have some questions from our participants that I would like to pose. We have quite a few, so I'm going to just grab a couple of them here. And I will just eeny, meeny, miny, mo one of the panelists to start. In this section, we have just a short period of time, so I will, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 questions. So I will just pose the question to one of you, and then we will move on to the next question, if that's okay. First question, what strategies could be adopted to achieve excellence in supply chain management in low and middle income countries? How about Aaron?
I go back to culture. And I think culture is a strategy. right? You got to have the right culture in place, and culture is free, right? It's all about a mindset. So I think that's a good starting point. And again, going back to Sally's point with the leadership, have the leaders engaged and dedicated to going down this path of supply chain excellence. Really, at the end of the day, it's the journey, right? The dedication to the journey, and then driving the right culture. They don't cost money, and they can go anywhere. Large organizations, small organizations. I don't think dollar value should drive that.
I have found that, like, when you go into companies, for example, in Mexico, they are hungry for, how do we do this? What can we do? It feels different from walking into, I'm not going to throw any part of the U.S. under the bus, but some plants you walk into in the U.S. and the workers look at you like, well, why are you talking to us? We're not going to do this. But I think in low income countries, people are looking for solutions more. So I think it's actually a great opportunity.
I see that as well.
I would also add that that when you enter into any situation and you're trying to learn Lean or Six Sigma or a combination of the two, that you really need to focus in on standard work. So I would just, the simple things of creating a process map visual, of showing people what does good look like, benchmarking the industry to make sure that you're understanding what successes have others achieved, right? And then really understanding problem solving so that you're solving the problems that your organization is facing in whatever country you're in. So it's truly about going through that journey together and really thinking clearly about what is it that our goal is, and what's in scope and out of scope, and how can we work together. Understanding those tactics and having that project management is so important in this process, right? So I would say that those would be my recommendations.
Okay.
Just an observation, the question was for low and middle income. So by definition, these people don't have a lot of money and they're struggling. So what can you do to minimize that? And all the conversations that the other three panelists have talked about are easy things to do, or easy things to embrace that don't cost money and can relate to them quickly.
Well, Beau, you ended there. I'm going to throw one at you. COVID has shown that the U.S. has a serious problem in the area of manufacturing. Do you all see a trend, all being you at this moment, do you see a trend for a higher demand for manufacturing facilities in comparison to warehousing, storage, or storage facilities?
Did you say that was for me or for Beau?
Beau.
Okay.
My personal opinion is distribution facilities, warehousing facilities, is basically accommodating a very long supply chain. So one of the issues you might want to think about in terms of improving supply chains, there are a few things you can do to improve a supply chain. One of them is to shorten it. And the reason we have these facilities now is because the supply chain is very long. So I would suggest thinking about more manufacturing facilities. And I'll even go back to, God, in late 90s, I was trying to convince people not to go to China because of the long supply chain. And I failed in every single attempt because it was always about cost. And we had a debate in one of my classes recently about shortening the supply chain to the US. And there was a person from one of the big three auto companies saying, nope, it's always about price. It's always about price, always about price, always about price. And one of the other students looked at him and said, well, didn't your plants get shut down for about 6 weeks for a $3 part from the East? And case closed. We went on to the fact there are more things out there than just cost. And Gary pointed that out too. There's a real cost of risk out there that we can't put into a piece part. And that belongs inside a conversation about how to bring more manufacturing more locally, wherever you are. It doesn't have to be the US, wherever you are, to have a shorter supply chain. I think it's always going to be more resilient if it's shorter.
Quick add-on?
Yeah, I'll add on. I want to go back, and I think it's maybe perspective on the statement or the question of that there's a problem and that we need to look or is there a trend to move manufacturing to the U.S.? I think maybe COVID, what it did is it caused us to ensure that we're thinking about our supply chain in whole in the future and ensuring that these risks are managed. But I don't necessarily think anybody's saying, oh, we need to move to the U.S. Maybe what we are saying is we should think about the U.S. and are those options and working those through. But I don't think that we're far enough along in that process to really say, yes, this is what we're doing. I think everybody's still working through all those pieces, because you think about it, not only are we going through that process of thinking about the U.S., but we're also going through the process of how do we reduce the cycle time within the current supply chain? What are the things out there that we can do today to do that? And the reality is, with technology, that's becoming easier to do too. So it's a journey. I think that that becomes an option that has always been there. Maybe it's just there's more awareness of that option.
Okay.
No, if I could just jump in. So I have a factory in the U.S. and when we launch a new product, we know what we can sell it for in the market, and accounting does the math for us and tells us, here's the price, so here's the cost that you have to hit for this to work for us. And initially, when we launch every product, we're not at that cost, but we tell the team, here's where we are, here's where the costs have to be. And they're certainly at a disadvantage because of their wages, but they understand that they have to find improvements to get the cost down, and they always do. Within a year or two, the new products are our most profitable. I think it's an issue that you turn to teams and give them the data and tell them what they have to do.
Perfect. Okay, Sally. Implementing Lean Six Sigma in a manufacturing setup is very much visible and relatable. Should a different approach be used to implement Lean Six Sigma in corporate functions to see best results? For example, these are not my words, 5S cannot be used in the case of corporate functions. What do you think?
I would disagree. I would say that you can 5S your workstation. Certainly if you're at your workstation, and most of us are working from home right now, can you imagine if in my corporate function, if I had to walk to my kitchen to get a pencil and come back? I mean, there's really ways that you could really set up your workstation to be productive for you. Having the standard work documentation is also important. So in that regard, what you would have is to limit the variability of the outcome of your work, you would really think through what is the best way to do something, the most efficient way. So whether or not it's an accounting function, a sales function, a warehousing function, these are not manufacturing, and in my line of work, this is what we do to improve time and time again. So absolutely, I think that a lot of folks are implementing Lean Six Sigma in hospitals as an example, and they're not manufacturing either. In service industries, they're definitely adopting those because through that data-driven approach, it's really important for us to make those incremental improvements so that when you hit the button on Prime Day, you can get your goods the next day, like I just received today. So absolutely, I think it can apply.
Were you going to add something, Beau? I'm going to have
Yeah,
and I'm going to go on to another question.
That's fine. Corporate deals with information, and you can 5S information really well. So if you think of all the information you have at your desk, most of it's on the computer. There are massive inboxes or massive files. How do we get to files and information quickly so we send the right file to the right person and not the older version? So I think there are a lot of opportunities to 5S the information, because that's the production flow inside corporate America. We produce information, so we can 5S that.
Great.
I would agree with Beau. With what we do with our corporate, whether it's travel or anything that we're dealing with, that automated workflow is so important so that we're not having to pick up the phone every single time you need to work with a cross-functional team member. So there's absolutely ways of using people, process, information, and systems in order to enable this, right? So I absolutely believe that this is the right way. There's really no modification that you would need there, because the visual management that you would need in a production line versus one for corporate environments are pretty similar, so that you can see whether or not you can use Kanban cards virtually, you know, if you're in an agile environment. It's very much applicable, right? So absolutely agree with Beau.
All right.
I just wanted to give a shout out to some folks who are online. My former boss, Sue Dukeshire from Northrop Grumman, is on the line, and a lot of my students are on the line. So I just wanted to thank you guys for joining us today.
And Sally is awesome, and they know that.
I don't have any fans, Sally. How could, great shout out. All right, last question, because we are right at time. We have 3 minutes left, so we'll have to be mindful of our time. Erin, I'm going to throw this out to you. I don't think I haven't been keeping track of who, if I'm being fair with questions or not. I think I'm being close, but what are the elements and their mix when determining if an organization is in the need for supply chain excellence? Is there a break-even point or a trade-off where this is determined?
So I think that's a tough question. You know, so I go back. I think this is going back to the journey and where we are, where the organization is in maturity and their willingness to accept and so on. And I remember a question being asked of me years ago, and that was, how do we measure and how do we say that we're ready for a journey? You know, what are these attributes? We say we have this list and we're ready. And then I go back and I think there's just really one attribute, is the leadership ready. Okay? And if we have the leadership ready, the rest of it falls into place. So I don't think that we can design out this this audit or something to that effect, that we say, okay, here's the things, if we have this, we're ready to start to talk about supply chain excellence. Supply chain excellence, it should be just a thing you do, right? Ideally, in my world, in my head, I'm thinking that everybody should just do it. That it should just be what you do, right? Versus not do. You know, anybody not doing it today really you're making the decision to not, right? And you're being left behind. But I go back, it's always that leadership commitment. If you have that one, everything else can be at different forms, but that's the start.
Any quick add-on? Very quick. We have 1 minute. Burning.
It always seems to me that it's not the team members who struggle with lean. It's the management. So I agree with Erin entirely.
Okay, well, this comes to the conclusion of our panel. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. I hope you've enjoyed our time together. I certainly have learned some things, and I hope that you will have taken at least one nugget, maybe 10, away from our discussion together. I do want to conclude with letting you know that we are going to be announcing the Lean Excellence Award right after this panel discussion. You can find that in your agenda. Click on the link, come join us. I will be announcing our award winner. So thank you all again. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you another time. Take care.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, everybody.